Pasquiquasanumis, Canupiam, everyone. Greetings and welcome. I'm Crystal Mars Baker, and I thank you for joining us today. Our free educational series is made possible through the generous support of the Rhode Island State Council on the Arts, the Pepito Opportunity Connection, the United Way, Rhode Island Foundation, and community donors like you. We're grateful for your continued support, which allows us to share this educational programming freely with audiences near and far. And this year, our Lunch and Learn series centers on revolution, asserting sovereignty. As the nation reflects on the American Revolution, we widen the lens to highlight Indigenous presence, leadership, and resistance, especially here in what we call the Southern Dawnland, where Indigenous nations have lived and governed since long before the United States existed. Through this series, we gather to learn from Indigenous voices and others and reflect on sovereignty as an ongoing practice rooted in land and community. Before we begin, a quick reminder is to place yourself on mute. You're welcome to share any questions or comments in the chat, and at the end of the session, we'll do our best to address them. And so we are honored again to welcome back Linford Fischer, who many of you may remember from last year's Lunch and Learn series. Linford is an associate professor at Brown University, a professor of history, at Brown University. He's also the principal investigator of a tribal collaborative database project titled Stolen Relations, Recovering Stories of Indigenous Enslavement in the Americas. And he is the author of several books, including his most recent publication titled Stealing America, Indigenous Slavery and Dispossession in the English Caribbean and the United States. So we're grateful to have Linford return and continue the conversation and share his insights with us today. So at this time, I welcome Linford to take over this session.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Crystal. And thanks to everyone for being here. It's hard to believe that 2 weeks ago, at least in New England, we were in the middle of a historic blizzard and had to postpone this event. But I'm really grateful for the chance to be a part of this important and neat series and set of conversations. So thanks so much for the kind invitation to be here and just for setting time aside to talk about these questions and issues. So my presentation today is related to the theme, as Crystal mentioned, of this year's Lunch and Learn series, which is Revolution, Asserting Sovereignty. And what I want to do is to share primarily drawn from two different projects that I've been working on for the past 10 to 15 years. The first, very quickly, is the book that Crystal mentioned that is available for pre-order, not out yet quite yet, comes out April 28th. But it's called Stealing America, The Hidden Story of Indigenous Slavery in U.S. History. And in this book, I'm trying to understand the long history of stealing both Native people and lands. And I think there's two processes, as many people on this call understand fully, are very connected. So the book really is a large-scale history. It starts in 1492. Examines the various processes of the early English colonial periods, looks at connections to the Caribbean, which in that time period were very, very closely connected in terms of shipping people in and out as servants and slaves. It looks at some large-scale slave trades of indigenous people in the Carolinas, as well as the Mosquito Shore, which is a part of Central America, where the English had an outpost there. Continues into the Revolutionary War, but then also follows American colonialism westward and examines how stealing Native people and land remained a core strategy in the American antebellum South, but also in areas like New Mexico and California. And so widespread was it that the U.S. Congress had to pass, after the Civil War, an entirely separate act in 1867 to try to curb the enslavement of indigenous people in the American West and even elsewhere sometimes as well. So the final two chapters of this book look at the boarding schools and adoption processes of the late 19th and 20th century, ending with 1978 and the Indian Child Welfare Act, because they seem very much connected to these longer histories of stealing and dispossession. So in this book, as I say here, I try to understand the cycles of enslavement and servitude and dispossession over multiple centuries as experienced by Indigenous people. Throughout, I highlight the way that the archives have hidden Native presence in especially context of slavery, performing what some scholars, Indigenous scholars, have called documentary genocide or paper genocide through racial shifting, sometimes in the records from sort of Indigenous or Indigenous are often called in the records to just slave or Negro, quote unquote Negro, or Black. So this is really widespread and persists, into the 20th century in all kinds of ways. So this book also centers on the actions and agency of Native nations and individuals and asserting sovereignty, which I think is maybe the most important thread in the book as well. And I would highlight, as you can see, the book features the stunning artwork of the Tamaquag's own Silvermoon LaRose, which I'm really grateful for. So the second project is related but not the same, and it's the Stolen Relations Project, which Crystal also mentioned briefly. This has been going on for about 10 years, and since 2019 is really closely collaborative with representatives from about a dozen regional Native nations communities. And we're trying to create a public resource that makes available information about individuals, Native individuals who are caught up in slavery and servitude in different kinds of ways, as well as the actual records that the information is drawn from. So we have about 7,500 records so far. The site is live, stolenrelations.org. Feel free to check it out. But it also includes contemporary interviews, artwork, music, poetry. There's a map, there's timeline, educational resources. And I should say, too, that I'm so grateful for the Tamaquag's key role in the development of this resource and the collaborations we've had with folks like Loren and others like Max Scott, who is on the academic advisory board as well. And many people on this call, too, probably, who I can't see all of you, but have been a part of these conversations in various ways. So a hugely collaborative project. And so some of the information, the conversations with tribal representatives over the years have shaped a lot of the book and, of course, this project too. So for today, I want to talk about some often overlooked experiences of Native people in the Revolutionary era more generally. And so I'll start by giving some broader background to the American Revolution. I know that Ned Blackhawk, who's wonderful, spoke last month, and I won't repeat, try not to duplicate what he said as well. But then I want to turn specifically to various experiences of Native people regarding enslavement and freedom in the war itself, which feels important. So first of all, a quick overview of Native experiences in the American Revolution, especially for those who weren't here last time or might be not as familiar with this topic. So first to state two somewhat obvious points. The first is that the American Revolution was only one conflict in a much longer struggle for Native sovereignty, which you could say started at the moment of colonization in 1492, or even slightly later here in North America, New England, as it's called, the Dawn Lands. Continued on through the 19th century and certainly is still going on today in different kinds of ways, perhaps not in the same military kind of a way of asserting sovereignty. Second, it goes almost without saying that Native communities and individuals experienced the American Revolution in vastly different ways. There was not one experience of this cataclysmic event. But most Native nations, when they could, preferred neutrality, especially those who are trying to sort of play off of two different emerging world powers. And yet it became very hard to stay neutral, as Native communities soon found out. Some Native communities and individuals sided with the British, quite famously in some ways. Think of the Haudenosaunee and Joseph Brant, for example, the Mohawk leader who was a firm British ally, or the Cherokee leader Dragon Canoe, who sided with the British because he was afraid of the American sort of impulse towards genocide and eradication and land grabbing. So this is, examples of people who maybe were forced, maybe chosen into taking sides with the British in this case. Others sided with the Americans. Again, some of the Haudenosaunee, certainly not all of them. Some nations within the American states also maybe felt either connections or compelled to side with Americans as well. One example of this is Joseph Johnson, Mohegan minister and leader who uh, corresponded with George Washington, is represented here in this image, quite famously again. And I would say too that on the western edge of American settlement, it's a whole different set of experiences as well. What is now Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, Native nations like the Cherokee and Shawnee had their communities pillaged by American militias, hundreds of people stolen from their homes, land taken, almost a separate war sort of on that western edge that was pretty dramatically different from what might have happened in New England, for example, although not entirely unrelated. But there's another forgotten or largely forgotten piece of this in terms of Indigenous presence and involvement, and that is with regard to slavery and emancipation. So that's what I want to focus on just for the next little bit here. I want to focus more specifically on the experiences of Native people related to slavery, related to unfreedom, attempts to secure their own freedom, because I think that this is a really interesting piece that, of course, is what I was trying to write about in the book as well. So, just as some broader background to the question of who and how many people are enslaved in the American Revolution who are indigenous and otherwise, it's not very easy to get a sense of this because of the sort of documentary genocide I mentioned earlier, the racial shifting, but also just the way that enslaved people were tabulated. They often obscured indigenous presence. But more broadly, scholars have estimated that approximately a 500,000 people were enslaved in the new American states in 1776 out of a population of 2.1 to 2.5 million, so around 21.5% of the population. And just in my own sort of spitballing and kind of estimations, as a starting place, we could say that maybe as many as 5% of the enslaved population was indigenous. It's likely much higher, but that means we're talking about enslaved population, indigenous enslaved population, as many as 25,000 people in all 13 states in 1776. And what I find most inspiring are the stories of enslaved people who use the rhetoric of the American Revolution and that broader era with its focus on freedom and equality to pursue their own freedom and doing so in different ways. So, one way that enslaved Native Americans um, asserted their personal sovereignty during the American Revolution was to self-emancipate from their enslavers. And there are dozens upon dozens of newspaper advertisements paid for by enslavers seeking the return of Native people who had run away. And we've tabulated a lot of them in the Stolen Relations database, certainly not all. And I discuss many of them in my book. And this screenshot here is of the results within the Stolen Relations Project of just a sampling of people who have self-emancipated or run away from enslavers precisely in this time period. One example of this, to drill down a little bit, is a woman named Patience, who self-emancipated from Stephen Potter of South Kingston, Rhode Island, in February of 1780. And Potter took out an advertisement for her and provided details that might help people find her. Again, these details are sometimes from the perspective of enslavers. There's a lot of analysis about these advertisements, and more that could be said about them too. If you just think about their very presence and what they do culturally, I think it's really kind of both fascinating, but also obviously awful too. They appear in the English colonies in 1704 as soon as newspapers start being printed. These advertisements for enslaved people, but also specifically that same year enslaved indigenous people. And it runs the whole span of slavery history in the United States as well. Indigenous people are constantly present in those advertisements. But these advertisements turn the average person on the street into sort of slave catchers with a financial incentive to sort of grab people they think might match the description or who are people of color who are suspicious and turn them into local authorities for interrogation. So, really is the beginning through newspapers of this sort of quasi surveillance state. But setting that aside, these sort of stories of self-emancipation as recorded in these newspaper advertisements, I think, are really a fascinating part of this history. Also, one thing that I think is really interesting is that the very first anti-slavery or abolition society in the English colonies in 1775, it was founded before even the United States was officially declared in 1776. The very first anti-slavery abolition society was founded specifically to try to free an enslaved Indigenous woman in Philadelphia, which I think we often forget. That seems very significant. So in the wintry months of 1772 and 1773, even before the Revolutionary War began, uh, a native woman named Dinah Neville, likely Lenape, petitioned for freedom for herself and her four children. So Dinah and her children were enslaved by Nathaniel Lowry in Flemington, New Jersey. And Lowry sold the four of them in the winter of 1772 and 73 to a Virginia merchant named Benjamin Bannerman. And Lowry took Neville and her four children to Philadelphia to meet Bannerman to complete the transaction. But while in Philadelphia, Neville bravely used the opportunity to protest her enslavement by declaring that she and her children were wrongfully enslaved and that she should be free. So perhaps surprisingly, or maybe not, I'm not sure, her protests attracted the attention of powerful magistrates in Philadelphia. Philadelphia was also a hotbed of Quaker anti-slavery activity at the time. The mayor of the city took Neville and her children into custody and then sent them to the city's workhouse, which was a rather horrible place where enslaved people and others were sent who did not have an obvious master or enslaver. So some Quakers in Philadelphia tried to secure her freedom through court processes, but a jury actually denied the petition, which I think is an interesting insight into sort of how the average person in Philadelphia viewed slavery and also indigenous slavery precisely on the cusp of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, which was sympathetic to anti-slavery thought. So this denial of Neville's petition for freedom led, as I said, to the creation of the first anti-slavery society in the American colonies. But note the name it was called the Society for the Relief of Free Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage, later called the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. There's a lot to unpack here, but it's revealing that Neville, who's clearly understood in the records to be indigenous, has sort of been forgotten in terms of this founding moment and also sort of erased in the name of the society as well. So notably, even in anti-slavery friendly Philadelphia, at least, members of this new society had limited success in freeing Neville, even with the foundation of the society. So two of Neville's children died in the workhouse due to really abysmal circumstances. The remaining two children were so emaciated when society members visited her and them. The society members petitioned to have them placed in the custody of Philadelphia residents at the age of 8 and 10, where they were likely treated as servants of some sort. But Neville remained in the workhouse for years. And also, just that separation of mother from children, I think, is something that is really striking too, that I've been thinking a lot about. Yes, maybe save the lives of the children, but there was a family cost to that as well. So finally, in 1785, 15 years roughly after her first attempt at freedom, society members simply purchased Neville's freedom. And that was sort of the end of the story, at least that phase of the story. So we might have forgotten Neville more generally. There's a small academic literature on this case that was helpful as I was sort of researching this. But people at the time period realized this was a really important case. And so the famous American painter Jeremiah Paul in 1795 painted sort of this moment of emancipation because he thought it was an important case. So he painted Neville as a light-skinned Indigenous woman in contrast to the darker-skinned individuals around her. And also, it's striking to me to think about the imagery here of her kneeling in this specific way. And we could unpack how she's represented in all kinds of other ways too. But the contrast or the sort of parallel between the way that she's positioned as imagined by Jeremiah Paul and then the sort of iconography of the emerging abolitionist movement in the 19th century, with this sort of kneeling and this phrase, "I'm not a man and a brother," which I think is really striking to place Indigenous people who were enslaved alongside of this larger movement too. Interestingly, the war could also lead to additional enslavement for Native people, sometimes in very strange ways. So, one example of this is the experiences of two free Native men from New England, Oliver Fry Sr. and Oliver Fry Jr., father and son. And early in the war, Fry Sr. and Jr. joined the Patriot effort by serving on American privateers who were tasked with harassing British shipping lines in the Caribbean. So they served on the Saratoga out of New London, Connecticut, when it was captured by the British out at sea, who promptly took the people of color on the ship and sold them into slavery, including the Frys. So both Fry men were taken to Jamaica and sold as slaves on different plantations. The father, Oliver Fry Sr., soon ran away and disappeared without a trace. But Oliver Fry Jr. tried unsuccessfully, at least at first, to secure his freedom in different kinds of ways. And finally, 15 years later, so took quite some time, was able to get the attention of some Jamaican colonists after the war who were sympathetic with his claims. So he and they first wrote to the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, and then that Pennsylvania Abolition Society wrote to the Providence Society for promoting the abolition of slavery in Rhode Island. And it fell to Moses Brown, the Quaker anti-slavery activist, to track down uh, Oliver Fry Jr.'s mother, who was a free Native woman living in Providence. And I have not been able to determine what her tribal affiliation was, perhaps Narragansett, I don't know. And from there, the story gets messy. So that sort of lineage back to a free maternal ancestor, which was the most critical thing for proving one's freedom, was proved. But the correspondence, as it was being shipped to Jamaica, got waylaid once and then maybe again, and we don't know. At least I've not been able to find out how this story ends, unfortunately. Potentially, Fry found a different way to find his freedom. Potentially, he remained enslaved in Jamaica. But again, thinking about this unique experience of the Frys during the war. It's also interesting to consider the experiences of, oops, sorry, I missed this forward here. So this is one of the documents that shows the Frys. It's interesting to think about the experience of enslaved natives claimed by loyalists. That seems also very fascinating to me. There's many examples of this, but this one in particular is quite fascinating. So this man named Hector, or James Wright, as he would go by sometimes, who was a child and found himself trafficked overseas, but through a different process. So Hector was approximately 4 years old at the start of the Revolution in 1775, 1776. He was enslaved by James Yarborough of Charleston, South Carolina. And importantly, Hector was a fourth generation enslaved person. And this multi-generational native slavery is something I'm trying to trace in the book just to show how this sort of actually has deep ramifications for families over time. And then only in the third or fourth generation, often is there attempt to free, to pursue freedom, usually in the late 18th, early 19th century. So his great grandmother, Diana, had been captured and enslaved in the Carolinas during the early 18th century, probably in the Yamasee War, maybe Queen Anne's War, some other conflicts in out of the Carolinas. Diana gave birth to a daughter named Mary, who was also claimed as a slave. Mary gave birth to a daughter named Phyllis, and Phyllis bore Hector, who was also born into slavery. So Hector's enslaver was a loyalist, and during the American Revolution, he, like many loyalists actually, at least some loyalists, just simply moved his entire household out of out of the United States. And in this case, he moved his household and all of his enslaved people to Jamaica first, and then to the Mosquito Shores. You can see from the map here this sort of long coastline in what is now Nicaragua and Honduras in Central America. And the Mosquito Shore, as I said before, was an unofficial English colony. And so Hector continued in slavery during these moves. But then in 1787, Yarborough was forced by the British government to move to Belize, or British Honduras, along with all the other colonists from the Mosquito Shore. And so Hector was taken to Belize, where he remains in slavery as well. And this is an image here of Belize, and also you can see the circle here, called British Honduras sometimes, but the location of present-day Belize as well. And then it wasn't until the 1820s when Hector was in his 50s, when he, as a large part of a group of indigenous people, sued for their freedom in Belize and was finally freed in the late 1820s. So a very, very long route from North America to Jamaica, Mosquito Shore to Belize, and finally to find freedom after so many years of enslavement and multi-generational enslavement in his family before that as well. The final example I want to give is perhaps the most well-known, which is why I sort of saved it for last, in Rhode Island at least, that of the First Rhode Island Regiment. And I just want to highlight that Tom O'Clock director Lauren Spears has this excellent book that she co-authored with Robert Geek that can give you much more information than I'll give here in just a minute or two about this really fascinating sort of episode here. But just to give a little snippet of what was going on as well in this time period, basically during the war and even before the war, many free Native and African people served on both sides, but both the Americans and the British tried to incentivize service by offering freedom for enlistment. So this was famously done by the British Virginia governor, Lord Dunmore, in 1775, which led to thousands of enslaved people, excuse me, running away and signing up to fight the Americans. This included enslaved indigenous people, and I found a few very scattered references that indicate that enslaved indigenous people too chose this moment to self-emancipate, join Lord Dunmore, and fight against the Americans, which is really fascinating as well. But a few years later, Rhode Island did the same, but of course, to incentivize fighting the British, fighting with the Americans. So in 1778, the Rhode Island Assembly offered freedom for any, quote, able-bodied Negro, mulatto, or Indian man slave, end quote, who enlisted to fight the British. So approximately 225 enslaved men signed up, received their freedom for service in the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. And this included 85 men who were clearly identified as Indian, and there were probably likely others as well. And I just want to again highlight the sort of erasure that I think Loren in her book and others have highlighted. This regiment is often called the Black Regiment, but it contained quite a number of indigenous people, which I think is part of this archival sort of even cultural and interpretive kind of erasure of the presence of Native people in all kinds of spaces and ways, but also their contributions to the American Revolution in this way as well. So the 1st Rhode Island Regiment served in high-profile skirmishes, including the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, which was the final major battle of the war. And then afterwards, these newly freed men who had survived the war, at least tried to integrate into society that was frankly not disposed to integrate them or to view them favorably. And so many examples of this, but Daniel Perry, for example, after the war, married a free Black woman named Ruth and settled in South Kingstown, Rhode Island. And there's other stories that you can follow up in the book From Slaves to Soldiers as well. Well, I've really only scratched the surface of the stories that could be told. I guess the risk of sounding presumptuous, I would say go read the book. The book has lots more information outside of the Revolutionary War as well, but there is a triad of chapters that deals with sort of anti-slavery, the Revolutionary War, and then freedom suits as well, which really tries to understand the ways in which Native people who had experienced slavery and servitude really used this period as a moment of claiming their freedom and sovereignty. And the Revolutionary War helped trigger a burst of freedom suits. And so the decades after the war it leads to one of the greatest spikes in freedom suits more generally, but also Indigenous freedom suits especially, that one of the chapters in the book kind of traces. But it also started the beginning of the end for slavery in northern states, which I think is really important, mostly through the gradual Emancipation Acts. And so this was a set of legislation that many northern states passed a version of, from sort of Pennsylvania to New York and Connecticut, and Rhode Island as well has its own. Rhode Island passes it in 1784, which basically says that after a certain date, all future children born to enslaved women, the children would not be enslaved. They had to serve a term of servitude, of indenture first. Um, but over time, as enslaved people essentially passed away, slavery itself would die off. So not a very brave set of legislation in a way. This is not emancipation across the board. This did not free currently enslaved people at the time period, but it was a sort of a hybrid kind of a little bit of a uh, I don't know, some sort of concession, I think, to people who were nervous, honestly, about having suddenly a whole population of free, formerly enslaved people amongst them. These acts also led to sort of reclassification of slavery as indentured servitude, since that was still permissible. And there's, lots of documentation around that as well. But I would just end by highlighting that through it all, Native communities and nations continued to press for their and fight for their freedom and sovereignty, in a process that you can chart in different kinds of ways legislatively throughout the 19th century, of course, into the 20th century. That maybe federal recognition was a solution for some in terms of that, but as we know in Rhode Island, that doesn't end questions of sovereignty. The state has continued to sort of suppress and refuse to recognize that sovereignty, and so that process continues to this day. And I think the Tamaqua and providing space to tell these stories, documenting these histories, these stories is a part of educating the public about present existence, but also the ways in which these kinds of struggles for sovereignty need to be continually pursued and waged in different kinds of ways. So, really, that's all I have for today. Would be happy to take questions, and we have lots of time for a conversation as well.
Fry is a family name in the Narragansett community, but also in the Wampanoag community, sometimes spelled Fry with an E. When you mentioned that, do you know specifically what community that Fry is related to?
Yeah, if you're asking me, I don't, but it was a really interesting point of investigation. I mean, part of the problem with writing a book where you're spanning centuries and centuries is like you don't always have the time to go as deep on every single episodes and anecdote that you want to. But
Mm.
this story has always stuck with me, and I'd like to return to Pennsylvania where some of these records are, look around in Providence as well. And if there are sort of community histories and stories that would be useful, it'd be really
Mm.
something neat to dig into. Thank you for the
Definitely. Let me just go through here. Yeah, so Alyssa thanks you very much for the presentation and asks, can you say more about successful freedom suits? Were there common characteristics that made a suit more likely to succeed? It's a good question.
Yeah, a lot of these freedom suits, it is a good question. Thank you for that. A lot of the freedom suits, and I think this is not just Indigenous people, but also sort of enslaved people more generally, African descendant people too. The biggest thing that you could sort of leverage to pursue your freedom is having a free maternal ancestor. So this is in a way turning this idea of partus sequitur ventrum, which is sort of this Latin phrase that sort of means as the condition of the child follows the mother, essentially, which was the justification for enslaving the next generation, could be turned on its head, where enslaved people say, well, if the condition of the child follows the mother and I have a free maternal ancestor, then I should not be enslaved, right? So this kind of brilliant strategy. So this is definitely an important part of it is demonstrating through sort of depositions and testimony of family members, community members, friends who knew the family to sort of give testimony about a mother, a grandmother, a great grandmother. Sometimes it goes back to multiple generations to prove that there was a free maternal ancestor. So that's a really important thing as well. Eventually, though, you get to the point where the courts in some states will grant freedom just based on the person being indigenous. And so that is a development that you see over time too. So in the Revolutionary era, most states aren't going to just grant indigenous people freedom out of hand because indigenous enslavement is seen as legitimate in many, and if not all, states. But over time, there is a sense that Native people are naturally free in a way that African descendant people are not, which is, of course, insane and doesn't make any sense to us. But that's the way that the legal world had been constructed. And it's actually an article by Christopher Wray that I really like a lot, talking about this kind of transition. Of course, there's a flip side to this. If you start to see Indigenous people as always being free and autonomous, then you have to redefine their citizenship and association with land differently and stuff like that as well. So it's not quite as good as it sounds, but it is an interesting feature of some of these freedom suits for sure.
Mm. Michael Bosworth asks, how widely was the Black Regiment drawn from? Just the Providence area, just Rhode Island, or beyond Rhode Island?
It's a very good question. I actually don't know the precise answer to that. This would be a Loren question. It is primarily Rhode Island, though. Primarily Rhode Island.
And then Laura Lemons comments that this was an excellent presentation. I agree, Laura. Will the book be available anywhere besides Amazon?
Yeah, I'm so sorry that is where it links to at the moment. It's available everywhere you buy books. So yeah, the Norton website, if you just Google, I don't know, Linford Fisher, Simply America, Norton, you'll find it right away. I apologize. I can find it, or if somebody else can find it and put it in the chat, that would be great.
Sylph. Joanne says, we have seen multiple examples of English colonists enslaving Native people as an outgrowth of war in the 17th century. Did the British, Loyalists, or Patriot Americans fighting during the Revolution sell Native peoples they captured into slavery in similar ways?
Yeah, thanks, Joanne. Great question. One of the places I was trying to figure this out is on that western edge of settlement. As you can imagine, that's where all the weird stuff goes down. And there are definitely examples of this. But it's often framed in the language of captivity. And so captives were taken. And there are some examples, but there's not a ton of American records documenting that sale. What you find more is Cherokee, Shawnee leaders petitioning to have people that were stolen from them returned. Women and children are often high on that list. And then sometimes when they sort of like hunt down these people, not hunt down, but like track down these people, they're serving in families, right? This is not like typically a case of adoption or something. These are still um, situations of servitude. So it is not as I was hoping to find a lot more transparency, but there is this sort of like sensibility that kind of emerges that this is not something to be talked about so transparently. But I will say there are some calls by American commanders and militia leaders that basically say, go into Cherokee territory and take captives, enslave people, kill them, do whatever you have to do, right? So
Mm,
the sort of rhetoric is there, the impulse is there. The other thing I would say is the incentives are there too. So this idea of pr- preceding the American Revolution of putting out, publishing bounties for taking people captive or bringing in scalps continues in the American Revolution as well, and that idea of bringing in live sort of captive indigenous people. Whether or not we know what happened to them, maybe they were used as sort of, bartering chips in this like international war. But I think that we have glimpses of this as a pathway to servitude as well, for sure.
mm. Natsu asks, do you see moments where colonial racial classification and taxonomies began to reshape indigenous community boundaries or belonging, particularly for people with both
Mhm.
African and Native ancestry?
Mhm.
Mm,
Yeah, so some of what I have seen, especially in New England, deals with attempts of Native nations who start internally policing racial boundaries in what feels like a new way in response to external colonial pressures. And I'm thinking of, I believe, I hope I'm getting this right, it's the Mohegans who, in like the 1770s, begin to, see some intermarriage with African descendant peoples. And then what they realize is that sort of if these multiracial people are being viewed by colonial authorities as non-indigenous, then colonial authorities can use that as justification to take the land. And so there's some internal policing in some cases, maybe not necessarily related to slavery, at least in that case, but an attempt to understand that claims to indigeneity as defined by colonial leaders actually has a real world effect in land claims and other kinds of claims as well. So, I think that I'm not saying that's the beginning, but it's one episode. And of course, as we all know, something that is still ongoing today, trying to sort of figure out who's in and who's out, and sort of especially with federal recognition and blood quantums and dating back to certain kinds of census rules. I mean, it really, of course, gets very, very complicated. And you do see hints of this in the 18th century for sure.
mm, interesting. Uh, okay. Lots of places where the books can be found, guys, in the chat. So feel free
Thank
to
you.
check that out. Heather Angel says, excellent thought-provoking presentation. Thank you. What lessons from the history you
Mhm.
describe in Stealing America do you believe are most important for communities and policymakers to understand today?
It's an excellent question. I don't know that I can speak for like the community side of things. There might be bits and pieces from the archive that are sort of new to communities and people, but the overall arc of the book, of course, is your history, their history, and is not going to be new. I think that I hope there's some inspiration in terms of that, like need to every generation sort of reassert and claim sovereignty and also to sort of claim a history and a presence throughout this long history. I think that's really important. In terms of policymakers, I mean, I don't have much hope at the moment, but there have been times when I think understanding this history would lead to a different way of thinking about present day policies that have led to certain outcomes that we are observing and dealing with today. And so understanding this history, I think for me and hopefully non-Indigenous readers helps us realize that like what we see in the present is the result of generation to generation of policies that were intended to sort of reduce, minimize, eradicate, assimilate, and everything else. And so we should be, I'm sure everyone on this call agrees too, having a much um, more radical sense of policies that support, enable, and elevate and return sovereignty, return lands back to Indigenous peoples. If the history is one of stealing, the future should be one of returning and one of giving. And maybe books like this and other excellent works like this will help to change that conversation a little
Mm,
bit. So
thank you. Michael Pear asks, was the first Rhode Island Regiment multiracial after reorganization and consolidation with the second Rhode Island Regiment in 1781?
I don't know. I'm so sorry. I should know more about this. And if I did know at one time, I can't remember offhand. But thank you for the question. I would refer you to slaves and soldiers, from slaves to soldiers.
Mm-hmm. And okay, another suggestion where you can find your book. Beautiful. Thank you for your presentation. Karen Lee says, can someone help me save the chat?
Mhm.
Okay, she's like me. I don't know how to save chats either. Um, Silver Moon will help you with that. All right. Marion Freiberg, can you highlight current struggles for sovereignty? Mhm.
This does not sound like a me question. This sounds like a experts on the call question. I don't know. Crystal, do you want to take a shot at
Mm.
this?
Ugh. So, here's what I'll say. Sovereignty for Indigenous communities comes in various forms, and actually, the newsletter that I'm researching and interviewing for right now will speak to sovereignty in all of those various ways, whether it's through music, whether it's through literature, such as the writings that are taking place by Indigenous peoples today. Um, in our policies, in our politics, obviously. So there's really a lot of ways that nations are seeking sovereignty, very individualized based on their communities. Um, so I don't know. It's hard to answer a question like that. It's so broad, it's so diverse, and I really think it's up to individual tribal nations to decide what are their struggles, what are they defining as their need for sovereignty. I will speak just personally in some areas because of how we live today, because of all that is taking place where land is very individualized and privatized. Sometimes the struggle for sovereignty is in your own private personal land boundaries, the deeds that were written up, and the encroachment that still takes place as towns established. What do they call those surveys, land
Hmm.
surveys, and as soon as you start putting these surveys in place, it changes the ancient landmark boundaries, and that can affect tribal nations. It can also affect individual tribal families that have been established for generations that are still using landmarks as their boundaries. And so that is a continued struggle.
Hmm.
Also establishing homes or businesses on tribal lands and trying to do it with the individual town or city laws that are in place. There are struggles there as well because sovereignty does mean that a tribe has a right to set its own, um, laws and practices where land is concerned, but there are some states and towns who don't honor some of those things, and there's all kinds of things written that can cause struggles there. So, um, even access to water rights, old agreements that have not, you have to dig up and resurrect some of these things. Um, and people can either accept what they're seeing or they can put modern day skews on things that were written in the past for the time of the past, and so that can work against you. So hopefully, it can work for us. But so there are a lot, just everyday type of issues. So I'll leave it like that because that's take a peek on the newsletter. Some of this might be in there, is what I'll say in the newsletter that will be written quarterly throughout this year, and hopefully, we'll be able to speak to some of that. Um, hmm. Yeah, so Dawn Dove, I think, is replying to that comment, saying the separation of families, um, children being separated from their families is something, old laws that are still doing that. You know, the recent Indian Child Welfare Act being questioned, trying to be repealed, but thank God that didn't get repealed because that is really just through the 1970s. Children could just be taken. So there are a lot of things that are still taking place that you have to constantly be on as a tribal nation to make sure. Let's see. Mary LaValle says, I live in the Philadelphia area and have been the residential boarding schools. So many folks are unaware and disbelieving of Indigenous enslavement. So true.
And one thing that I think a lot of people don't know is within the residential boarding school system is the outing system, right? Where like you not only within the school is half the day spent laboring, which feels really resonant to these older histories of commandeering Indigenous children's labor, but also and the separation from families, but also the outing system, which became very popular in Carlisle and then was spread to other schools as well. The Phoenix Indian Boarding School, for example, where children were sent year round outside of the school into white houses where they labored for sometimes room and board, sometimes for just a few pennies a day,
Mm,
which felt like another form of servitude as well. And sometimes that's how boarding schools were sold to communities. When the head of the BIA went to Phoenix, he basically said, I can give you a supply of very cheap indigenous labor. And people are like, excellent, let's have a school here. So this was a sort of new way of propagating indigenous servitude in certain ways. And I
mm,
know that boarding schools, lots of ways to interpret them. They became, in some cases, really important meeting grounds and spaces for students. That's absolutely true, and
mhm.
students did get educated, but the sort of idea behind it was rather pernicious, obviously.
So true. True. Just looking for what? Oh, Marion asked, what? Oops, where did it go? What triggered your writing this book?
Yeah, great question. So it is when I was researching for the first book, which was The Indian Great Awakening, which I was trying to understand Indigenous engagement with religion and colonial New England, and uh, was looking at church records to try to understand if and how Native peoples in southeastern New England related to churches. Did they get baptized? Did they join churches? And what I kept finding is often ministers, but not always ministers, white church members bringing indigenous people for baptism, and sometimes children, sometimes adults, and they were often listed just as servants and sometimes slaves of people. And I just didn't really have a register for that. And that's my fault. That's on me coming out of grad school. I didn't really have a sense of this broader picture of the longevity of and sort of, indigenous enslavement and slavery, enslavement and servitude in New England. And so that was new to me, and I just wasn't sure what to do with it. So I kind of put it aside, finished the first book, published it, and then began to sort of try to understand this history more generally. And what I really discovered is that I just couldn't stop with New England. I couldn't stop with the colonial period. Like you just keep finding stuff everywhere and the connection to the Caribbean. So I had to go down to Barbados and Jamaica and Bermuda to try to sort of understand this history and the trafficking back and forth, and led me past the revolution and into the antebellum South, where I think tens of thousands of indigenous people are serving on southern plantations, for example, into the American West, and then into boarding schools. So a little tiny question mark in the archive led to a lot of other history that, again, is not new for many Native communities, but certainly is not something that I was taught in schools for sure.
Yeah, I just, Lynn, That's so important because many of us, I mean, even in my time, I didn't know this.
Mm,
I knew about
mm,
slavery because they teach that little snippet of slavery. But I truly didn't know about indigenous peoples being enslaved, and
mm.
I'm indigenous. So it's not
Right.
something that's in your everyday life. Sometimes you don't think about it. But then a lot of these presentations, it's so important the work that you do because these presentations enlighten us so that our children do know
Mm,
going forward.
mm.
A lot of times we know better when we can do better when we learn and when we know what's in the past. I just want to,
Right.
Dawn is saying, so she was thinking of the immigration policies of today when we were talking about the issues of
Mm,
sovereignty, also
mm.
separating children in those families. And she was wondering
So
what other
true.
policies go back to early politics toward indigenous peoples.
I mean, the sort of policing of non-white bodies and treating them differently with certain regulations is certainly part of that. The policing of boundaries and borders and who can come in. Mobility, questions of policing mobility is really common as well, and targeting certain people groups. Um, and rhetorically targeting certain people groups, I think, as well. So yeah, I'm sure there's a lot more that could be said, but I do think that you're putting your finger on something really important, which is there's not a whole lot that's new today, and these tracing back to sort of the way in which indigenous people and sort of the way English colonists dealt with native peoples in New England, but also elsewhere on the East Coast, does kind of set a template in a way for white supremacy, for sort of privileging certain people groups, and for how, from like a white colonial perspective, how to sort of, I'm using this word in quotes, manage, right, populations that are sort of that you want to control. So absolutely, I think you're right to point that out.
Mm. And one final question before we draw to the end. Do you believe there would have been children born between slave owners and indigenous people? And is there evidence of that?
It absolutely happened. I would have to sort back through and try to find some very specific examples of this. I mean, again, this is not often something that is broadcast widely. What you sometimes find is like special treatment in wills or in other kinds of estate handling that comes later, or freedom granted early, or the children treated separately, specially, or something like that.
Mm.
But wherever there's differentials of power and slavery, there's going to be uh, rape and other kinds of relationships like that for sure. So
Mhm. To Botaniana Way in Linford and Tamacog Museum. Thank you, Dawn, for joining us. Thank you. Karen says thank you. That is her interest as well. And I'm just going to, thank everyone. Thank you, Lynn, so much for this presentation. So informative. Thank
mm.
you for everyone who joined us today. Obviously, there's no learning at Lunch and Learn if you're not here with us. So this presentation will be available on our YouTube page for those who wish to revisit it. Feel free to share it. We hope you'll join us next month as we continue our Lunch and Learn series, Revolution Asserting Sovereignty, and as we carry this conversation forward together. Please remember to visit our website for any additional upcoming events. We hope that you all have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Crystal and Tamaqua.
Thank you.